3 years ago, this guy here claimed that the RTX 4050 Mobile has issues and might be a bad choice for the future. Ha! Loser, so cringe. Please let me know in the comments what you think about that. However, today, right now, we're actually in said future. So this is the future. Wow. But where's GTA 6? Whatever. Today we're going to retest the RTX 4050 Mobile in a lot of new games that have been released since then to see if and how well they are still playable despite this card only having 6GB of RAM. And you know what? Thanks to Iniba, buying so many games to actually just benchmark and test them is much more affordable for me. Today's video is brought to you by Iniba. You want really cheap games and you're tired of waiting for the next big sale just to grab your favorite game? Yeah, same here. That's why I've personally been using Iniba for years now and they've never let me down. It's a massive online marketplace where you can get legit game keys, software licenses and gift cards for way less than you'd pay in the official stores. We're talking Steam, Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo and more. It's all there. You just pick your platform, check out the low prices and get an instant delivery of your keys. No more FOMO, no more waiting for Black Friday or Steam sales. Whether you're looking for that one game everyone's talking about or you just need a cheap Xbox Game Pass subscription, Iniba's got you covered. And it's all digital, super fast and super simple with, in my opinion, the best user experience of all key shops. So next time you're about to overpay, maybe just don't? Check out Iniba instead today via my links in the description. For this video, I'm actually using an Acer Swift X14 that I just happen to own right now, which is paired with 32GB of DDR5 4800 megatransfer RAM to rule out a RAM bottleneck, and a slightly throttling i7 13700H, since this one here is quite a hothead. And I've actually reviewed this laptop 3 years ago. The 4050 in here is a lower powered 50W version, so the FPS we'll see today will be some kind of baseline, and other 4050 laptops might perform a bit better. Well, today we're going to focus a bit more on the VRAM situation, and I will use the graphics settings accordingly. PS, feel free to subscribe to the channel for a similar GTX 1060 Mobile 10-year anniversary video in the near future. Now, one issue with 6GB of VRAM is that Windows 11 is using quite some VRAM for the operating system itself. So the displayed VRAM usage is the total usage and not only what the game needs. The vast majority is still gaming on Windows, though this could be a bit better on Linux systems like CashOS, Bassite or Mint, at least considering the VRAM allocation. But recent tests by other channels show that often Windows is still leading in pure performance. Now for the RTX 4050 Mobile, the small memory bus of only 96-bit and the memory bandwidth of only 192GB per second put a lot of pressure on the already small 6GB of VRAM. That means the GPU can't move as much data between the VRAM and the chip per second compared to higher tier models. And this is important. That's getting worse with higher resolutions, and it's therefore definitely a 1080p card for modern games, while older and very easy titles can do 1440p here and there. Also, DLSS is helping a lot and it's reducing the actually rendered resolution, taking away some of that pressure. I actually compared that with a full-powered 4050 laptop a while ago in this video. But to be honest, for an entry-level laptop, 1080p and let's say DLSS on quality is usually very okay indeed, considering we're mostly playing this on 14 to 17-inch displays as there was no RTX 4050 desktop. For my tests, I didn't use any frame generation in today's video, as I A, almost never use it anyhow, and B, it uses even more VRAM, which we often can spare for that, as you will see. I was mostly trying to use medium or even high settings if that was possible and still playable, so I kind of tried to maximize the VRAM usage. Also take the results with a grain of salt, because some games that seem to work here could still run into problems if the VRAM is almost full after a while of playing, especially in longer gaming sessions or in certain parts of a game that is quite unpredictable for regular benchmarks. In the best case, the textures just aren't loading correctly and the game starts to look ugly, and in the worst case, a game crashes. The first game for today will be Assassin's Creed Shadows, which was released almost exactly 2 years after the RTX 4050 Mobile, and while it is a very demanding game for GPUs on most tested systems, it runs pretty stable, though usually with lower FPS than expected. First, we are going to take a look at the low preset at 1080p, important, not the very low one, and I also used DLSS on balanced. With these settings, the VRAM usage for the total system clearly is below 6 GB here, with around 4.3 to 4.7 GB. The FPS are actually quite good with around 64 FPS on average and very good 1% lows of 48 FPS. Now switching over to medium settings instead with DLSS on quality, that already brings the VRAM to its limit with around 5.9 GB. And usually if the VRAM is reported to be that high, that means it would like to have more available. The average FPS drops by almost 20 to around 45 FPS, and the 1% lows aren't as good anymore in comparison with now around 31 FPS. It's not like the game becomes unplayable, and it's hard to tell if some of the performance reduction is caused by the VRAM, but the frame time graph now was unusually rough for that game. Now, a higher powered 4050 might get some more average FPS here, but it's possible that in longer gaming sessions and in some scenes, it could become a real problem with medium settings. So low might be the only safe way to play that game on the RTX 4050 Mobile. For our graders, the VRAM usage was around 4.5 to 5.4 GB when I was using the high preset with DLSS on quality, while that actually gave me great frame rates even on this low powered 4050. 80 FPS on average, though suboptimal 1% lows of 43 and some slight micro stuttering. Pretty sure those haven't been caused by the VRAM or the system RAM, but maybe the slightly throttling i7 13700 in my Acer Swift X14. But in general, our graders is optimized pretty well and definitely playable on an RTX 4050 Mobile or a 6GB VRAM card for that matter. VRAM-wise, Avowed seemed to be playable with medium settings and DLSS on quality at 1080p with an average of around 54 FPS. Though, once more, the 1% lows aren't great, while the VRAM usage was somewhere between 5.4 and 5.8 GB depending on the current camera angle and area. It was noticeable from the beginning when I first tested the 4050 Mobile 3 years ago that the bandwidth memory bus limitation might be causing more micro-stuttering and unstable frame times than other GPUs with bigger bandwidth and memory bus. It's not always clear what exactly is causing that, but it is an important factor. Of course, what you can always do is use lower settings and set an FPS cap, which is taking off some pressure of the whole system, because I think a higher powered 4050 would not really get a noticeably better result. Now, is Avowed playable with medium settings on the RTX 4050 Mobile at 1080p? Yeah, if you're not too sophisticated. Is it great? No, certainly not. The VRAM usage for Crimson Desert, which was just released in March 2026, seemed to be surprisingly low. At 1080p with medium settings and DLSS on quality, that was around 4 to 4.5 GB with an average FPS of around 49 and 1% lows of 38. While I was benchmarking it, the usage actually went down again to around 4 GB after hitting 4.5 GB. Pretty well optimized for such a brand new game with that kind of graphical fidelity. Consider me impressed. But what really baffled me, we could even play it with ultra settings at 1080p on DLSS, since it only seems to use around 500 MB more VRAM, and even the FPS are almost as good. And I triple checked that, only 4 FPS less on average. While to be honest, the game already looks pretty good on medium settings to begin with, and I'm not really sure if the system is actually using the ultra settings here. Clair Obscur Expedition 33 was released almost exactly 2 years after the RTX 4050 and ran just fine with medium settings at 1080p in combination with DLSS and quality. VRAM usage was around 5 GB, while the FPS were around 50 to 70 FPS depending on the scene, and an average of around 66 FPS with 1% lows of 38. Not a problem, at least as long as you're okay with medium settings. Probably exactly nobody would play Call of Duty Black Ops 7 with ultra settings on an RTX 4050 Mobile, but just to prove that VRAM is not an issue in this game, which isn't that surprising, as it's an esports title, I actually did. In combination with 1080p and DLSS on quality. And the VRAM usage was around 4.8 GB, which leaves us some headroom to skip DLSS, and the average FPS was even above 60 with around 76 on average and decent 1% lows of 53, at least in my 10-minute Nuketown test run. I was testing Dragon's Dogma 2, released 1 year after the RTX 4050, with a mix of low and medium settings at 1080p to get around 60 FPS-ish on average for this laptop. 1% lows were at 37 FPS. The game looks quite muddy in my opinion and washed out that way, while the VRAM usage was between 4.8 and 5.3 GB for the whole system, so should be fine with these lower settings since I didn't run into issues in my over 30 minutes long test run. Diablo 4 was released just a few months after the RTX 4050 and at 1080p and ultra settings with DLSS on DLAA, meaning we're at 1080p native, with anti-aliasing. The RTX 4050 had no problems with over 60 FPS on average, decent 1% lows most of the time, and the VRAM usage seemed fine as well, so let's just jump right to the next game instead. Which is Doom the Dark Ages. 2 years younger than the RTX 4050, was just about running with close to 6 GB of VRAM usage, and that's at 1080p, low settings, and even with DLSS set to balanced only. The FPS were technically fine, averaging around 70 with solid 1% lows of 51 FPS, but you can already tell things are getting really tight here. And again, that's at 1080p, low settings, plus upscaling. It's getting dangerously close to a critical point because aside from dropping the resolution even further, there's not much headroom left here. Forza Horizon 6 is just brand new, looking good, lots of fun, but it is quite a bit more demanding on your hardware, while it's still not the toughest game to run compared to its predecessor. And I was testing the game at 1080p with high settings and DLSS on quality, and I would definitely use DLSS over TAA here since in my opinion it just looks way better. VRAM wise that seems okay with a usage of around 4.8 to 5.2 GB, and performance wise I still saw a very playable 76 FPS on average, and the 1% lows have been fine as well with around 51 FPS. So overall no complaints, playable at 1080p, high settings with over 60 FPS, and a fully fledged RTX 4050 could probably do 90 FPS or more here. Helldivers 2, released 1 year after the RTX 4050, seems to have no issues with high settings at 1080p native without any upscaling. Even the 50W version was getting 56 FPS here with very good 1% lows of 48 FPS. The VRAM usage is not an issue here like at all, only around 4.2 GB in my whole session. Using higher settings wouldn't make much sense here FPS wise, at least for the lower powered card I'm running in this laptop here. Indiana Jones was the first game that I know of that crashes with 6 GB of VRAM if you're using it at 1080p, even with the lowest settings, even with tinkering around in the ini files, reducing the texture pool size and whatnot. So I was actually forced to run this at 720p. Yes, 720p low. Well, at least it was 720p low and native. And despite the 50W 4050, I saw decent frame rates of around 60 to 70 FPS on average. So 1080p with DLSS would surely be doable if we only had more than 6 GB of VRAM. 1% lows of around 50. For some reason, the wattage of the 4050 was not shown here, and it was not even close to a 100% usage. And no, we are not using the iGPU here. VRAM usage seems to be below 6 GB, but I'm not sure about that to be honest. So that game is definitely initiating the end of cards with only 6 GB of VRAM. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is the direct opposite. I was able to use the high preset at 1080p with DLSS transformer set to quality, high settings, and I even saw an average of 60 FPS here. And all of that with great 1% lows of 45 FPS using around 5.5 GB of VRAM. And if all games were optimized that well, 6 GB would actually still be okay for 1080p. But in reality, things often look different. The Oblivion Remaster though surely isn't optimized very well. Low settings with DLSS on balance resulted in 30 to 70 FPS, while it depends a lot on the area we're in. Sometimes the FPS dropped below 30 even. The VRAMs seem to be fine, though 1080p low with DLSS balanced isn't that impressive to be honest. So this one's a mixed bag if you ask me. Launched a few months after the RTX 4050, Palworld seems to be perfectly fine, using around 4.1 GB of VRAM, using the high preset at 1080p in combination with DLSS on quality, with playable average FPS of around 63 FPS and 1% lows of, well, unfortunately only 20. But those weren't caused by VRAM or the lack of it. However, it's perfectly playable on the RTX 4050 mobile. Spiderman 2 is another problematic title when it comes to VRAM, as you might know. Though, at least using the low preset with DLSS and quality at 1080p seemed to work okay with around 56 FPS on average, while the 1% lows haven't been great with only 33 FPS. But already using medium settings would cause either texture loading issues or heavy frame drops. Well, at least it's still playable in some way and well, you can have fun with it on this laptop. I also added Subnautica 2 into the mix since it just achieved early release status, and I liked its predecessor a lot. Again, 1080p and medium settings in combination with DLSS and quality is usually the way to go here. And this time I saw a still playable average of around 58, while the 1% lows haven't been optimal with around 30 FPS. But the VRAM usage seems to be still okay with 5.4 to 5.7 gigabytes. And well, the game looks super great in my opinion. It's Unreal Engine 5 though, might be some transfer/shader stuttering that I experienced here. Or maybe we'll need just newer drivers or game updates. The VRAM usage went up to over 5.9 gigabytes when I was also trying the high settings instead with DLSS and quality, but the average FPS now dropped to 45 FPS in that case. And I did experience some more stuttering than before. Not sure if that would be stable for longer sessions, but it seemed to be okay in my 15-minute long benchmark run. Now, The Last of Us 2 was clearly better optimized than Part 1 at its release. The game is playable at medium settings with an RTX 4050 mobile and the 6GB of VRAM. In combination with DLSS and quality, I didn't notice any severe texture issues or heavy frame drops, around 50 to 70 FPS depending on the current scene, though the CPU usage was surprisingly high. Keep in mind that a higher powered RTX 4050 can deliver a few more FPS in general, maybe even paired with a better CPU. Alright, to be honest, it's not as bad as I or maybe some others expected, as in it's not a problem in all games yet. At least almost every game was playable in an okay way, despite this only being the 50-watt version of the card if the settings were tuned accordingly. With the exception of Indiana Jones, which needed further manual tuning at 720p to prevent crashing due to VRAM limitations. And for more and more games, you will need to use low settings, as even medium will become a problem. But then, well, this is a 3-year-old entry-level laptop GPU. We shouldn't expect high-end performance, yet 8GB would have been fair, seriously. And it's good that the new RTX 5050 mobile does have 8GB now. Keep in mind that a 100-watt driven RTX 4050 laptop will give you around 15 to 30% more FPS, while of course the VRAM issue isn't affected by that at all, and if it's running out of VRAM, it might not perform better than the 50-watt version here. However, in some games, even medium and low settings are becoming a problem, even at 1080p and with upscaling as we saw. And for some titles, it's just kind of unpredictable if the game is really going to be okay with the VRAM usage all the way through, if it's at the brink of 6GB, or if at some point in a gaming session there would be frame drops or even crashes due to that limitation. Esport titles and competitive games are and will be less of a problem compared to some AAA titles, single-player games, especially if they have suffered from a rather bad conversion from consoles or they are unoptimized in general. And that's all for today's video. If you enjoy the content, consider liking the video or even subscribe to the channel, because that helps a lot. Thank you. And also thanks for watching until the very end. See you next time. Bye bye and tschüss.